Welcome, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Centre for Global Higher Education webinar number 246. My name is David Mills. I'm Deputy Director, and it's a real honour today to be hosting a great team of speakers, all of whom hail from the Manchester Institute of Education at the University of Manchester. And there's five colleagues: Jenna Mittelmeier, Sylvie Lomer, Josef Ploner, Heather Cockayne, and Miguel, and they're together going to be talking about the challenge of working with international students and what does an ethical practice with international students look like. And so they each have a presentation thinking about the unethicality of current practices, the coloniality of current pedagogies, thinking about ethics and etiquette, thinking about meaning making, learning from students, and thinking about contacts and partnerships. But they're going to tell us all a lot more about this. Before we start, I'm going to give you a few bits of notes for our housekeeping. Please keep well, the first thing to say is this is being recorded. And so if you'd like to speak in the questions afterwards, you will be recorded as well. We will post a transcript of the chat at the end. And this is something to say about the way in which we run the seminar series. Please keep yourself muted and keep the video off until and when at the end of the talk, when if you'd like to ask a question, if you pipe it in the chat, I can ask it for you as well if necessary. And then I'll ask you to come forward, put your video on, and you can ask a question. So please use that function at the end of this talk. And I'll hand over, no further ado, to Jenna, who's going to start this talk. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just get slides on the go. Great. Well, thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks for having us here today. So my name's Jenna Mittelmeier. I'm a lecturer in international education at the University of Manchester in the UK, and I'll be leading this panel today alongside my colleagues Sylvie, Miguel, Heather, and Josef, who are all also based at the Manchester Institute of Education. We're part of a larger institutional consortium of around 35 researchers who do higher education research across our higher education research network, which is called Here at Manchester. So we did just want to put a plug at the start to say that we're very interested in cross-institutional collaborations with other groups of higher education researchers. So please do be in touch with us if that's of interest to you or your colleagues. How we'll do the session today. So each speaker has a very strict 8-minute time limit to share their perspectives about different facets related to the question that's driving our session today, which is about what do ethical supports for international students look like? And then we'll save the question and discussion for the end, but just to say that we will all be active in the chat while other colleagues are speaking. So please do feel welcome to start the conversation there as we go along. We'll focus today specifically on the day-to-day work with international students after their arrival to their host institutions, but we all also do research into the broader kind of marketized economy that contributes to the narratives that we'll be discussing today. But to focus all of that into a single session would last us the rest of the week. So we'll focus today specifically on support structures for and with international students. But I think that throughout most of our contributions today, we'll be talking about how institutions and individuals can develop what we're calling an ethics of welcome towards international students, which is something that my colleague Josef will come to at the end of the session. But what we want to do today is not to provide a how-to guide for best practices with international students, but instead to hopefully provide some reflection points to get all of us thinking about how practices with international students can and should be approached differently. So I'll be starting us off today, and what I want to do is, before we talk about ethical practices, is to provide some thoughts about what is potentially unethical about the ways that many universities support international students. So here we go. First, I think we should question about how international students are defined within higher education, as there's a tendency for us to categorize our student populations according to visa status into a binary. So either you're international or you're not international. However, we feel that this categorization is often oversimplified and that individual identities and the ways that people relate to the international, however we want to define that, doesn't always fit into really neat little boxes in this way. So what ends up happening is we're often obscure the cultural and linguistic diversity of students without a specific international student visa. But it's this categorization that often frames the support services that are available for students. So for example, that language support might be targeted at international students when actually this supports student cohorts more broadly outside of students with international visas. And then second, and perhaps relatedly, are the ways that we often homogenize international student populations. So through assumptions that they're a single collective group with similar needs and experiences, without really reflecting on the significant diversity that's present within this student group, and how international students represent dozens of nationalities and cultures and ethnicities, languages, religions, and so on. So, just for example, Chinese international students are a prominent group for many countries around the world, and there's a tendency to refer to the Chinese international student experience without really reflecting on the dozens of regional language varieties and ethnic groups that are present within China. But then those assumptions of the Chinese international student experience, which doesn't even exist in the first place, is then often applied to international students in other parts of the world. So one outcome of that homogenization is that we oftentimes fail to see the intersectionalities of international students' identities and experiences. An example from within the UK is that international students are not included in national data that's collected about student race or disabilities, meaning that students from various marginalized groups are at least numerically, but I would also argue structurally, left invisible at a national level. International students are also infrequently included in equality and diversity committees or initiatives which tend to focus on home student diversity. So the significant marker for international students, their difference gets deduced down to nationality, which again is something that we argue is problematically oversimplified. Another ethical concern is about the ways that deficit narratives frame how individuals and institutions think about international students. And what I mean by that is that there's assumptions that international students lack particular skills for success. So for example, that international students lack language skills, that they aren't critical thinkers, that they're poor writers, that they don't participate. These are pervasive discourses across practice, but also research about international students that kind of perpetuate these problematic assumptions that international students lower standards or are lower quality students compared to home students. And I think it's these narratives probably more so than any other that frame and shape the supports that are offered to international students. So international student supports becomes about assimilation without reflecting on the colonial assumptions that underpin such practices, which is something my colleague Sylvie will talk about in a moment. But we tend to see practices about international students being about how to fix deficiencies and how to assimilate them to a normative expectation of what a good student is assumed to be, rather than thinking of the more transformational and I would argue decolonial approaches to education in intercultural settings. But then at the same time, there's this kind of juxtaposing narrative that sensationalizes international students while simultaneously viewing them as deficient. So that idea that international students make our classrooms more diverse, make our societies more intercultural, that they are resources that benefit others' learning, something that my colleague Miguel will reflect on as well. There's often an assumption that by sticking people from different places into a room together, that this somehow magically develops a meaningful intercultural experience. But this assumption ignores issues of bias, of racism and discrimination, and it also fails to consider whether international students want to represent their country to their peers, whether they feel comfortable doing so, or whether the pedagogies and the curricula that we use are transformative and inclusive enough for international students to make meaningful supported contributions in a safe environment. And that's something that my colleague Heather will explore as well. So as we go through the panel today, my colleagues will kind of draw on some of these issues and their individual reflections. But what I want to do is encourage in our discussion today to move away from these kind of what I would call tired, dehumanizing stereotypes of who international students are assumed to be and what they're expected to contribute to their host institutions and societies. So just to summarize, I guess that we feel that practices with international students become unethical when they rest on assumptions about homogenization, deficit narratives, and assimilation, and when they fail to engage with the underlying power structures and coloniality that frame such perspectives. Before I hand to Sylvie, a small plug that I did want to make. So I'm the research and context section editor for Journal of International Students. And what this section is a set of shorter 2,000 word peer-reviewed submissions that are intended as conceptual pieces that reflect on critical issues and specifically intend to reimagine research and practices with international students. So just to say, if today's session sparks any ideas that you'd like to develop further, please do be in touch with me and consider publishing through this outlet. But with that, I will hand over to Sylvie.
Thank you, Jenna. That was a masterly overview of a number of the key issues. I'm focusing today on specifically UK higher education pedagogy and the teaching and learning practices, and what we're calling the implicit coloniality that we see in some of those. This is based on some data that Jenna and I have collected, funded by the Society for Research in Higher Education. And we're acknowledging here that it was UK oriented. So some aspects of these pedagogic practices may not transfer for those of you who are joining us from elsewhere in the world, and would be interested to hear about those aspects that you think do and don't transfer. When we're talking about coloniality here, I'm drawing on concepts from Latin American theorists like Walter Mignolo and Aníbal Quijano, who understand coloniality as not just the material domination that we saw in historical contexts. Could I just ask everyone to check their microphones, because I'm getting a little bit of an echo. But also as what Musavi calls the intellectual colonization. So in this, we're talking about the dominance of historically powerful modes of thought and epistemologies that have originated from the West and from English-speaking countries. Could we go to the next slide, please, Jenna? So what we identified in speaking with lecturers is that a wide range of teaching and learning practices in the UK, they are all, of course, socio and culturally and historically mediated, but we often don't have the time, space, leisure and incentive to subject this to critical reflection in ways that would encourage us to decolonize those practices in ways that might parallel the better known movements to, for example, decolonize the curriculum by incorporating a wider range of theorists from the global south and perhaps international case studies. We didn't find a predominant trend in lecturers from our study to seek to internationalize or to adapt pedagogy and teaching and learning practices to become more internationally inclusive. Instead, they implied that they did not need to change their practices in response to international student presence, since they were already delivering best practice. And indeed, it's that capacity to recruit international students and attract people from all over the world to the UK that is used as evidence for our teaching practices being best quality and best practice. So I want to highlight 4 practices that I think should be subject to greater critical reflection. One of those is the kind of classic open-ended seminar in which a lecturer might begin by saying, discuss the reading. assign an article, come in and expect a free-flowing discussion to take place. As Jenna has highlighted, the positive attitude towards international students highlights multicultural expectations and expectations around intercultural learning, which are thought to happen by leaving space for that kind of open-ended discussion. Another is the idea of a typical academic essay, so where an instruction involves simply write an essay and the expectations around what constitutes an academic essay are not necessarily unpacked. Intercultural group work can also be problematic, where the expectation is that groups will develop with students from other countries and that intercultural learning is a key part of the learning objectives. There was a common narrative as well that I'm not a language teacher, or I can't proofread your essay. And I'm sure that those of you who are lecturers have also said this. In part, many of these concerns are down to resourcing, workload issues, and structural constraints that we may not indeed be allowed to proofread or read whole drafts of student essays, depending on the expectations and quality assurance processes at various institutions. So instead, in that scenario, students get referred out to what is often provided in a central capacity, often through a language centre or generic skills support. Can we go to the next slide, Jenna? So some of the challenges here relate strongly to what Jenna has already said about deficit narratives. In discussions in open-ended seminars, for example, if students fail to participate, don't speak up, this can often be blamed on individual or groups of international students lacking the skills, the willingness, the confidence to participate in verbal discussion. Similarly, if academic writing is unsuccessful, if plagiarism occurs, if group work is unsuccessful, responsibility for that can be deflected onto the international student who is expected to assimilate and to conform to expected modes of engagement based on a historical model of what learning and teaching looks like in the UK. So because international students are not always seen as epistemic equals, and that can be true both from staff and students, we can end up in a situation where those pedagogic practices can position international students as still further in deficit, and they can reinforce those models by providing feedback, for example, on an academic essay that deflects responsibility for learning how to write an essay away from the structures of education, away from the classroom and the teachers, and onto the student themselves. So in the case of delegating language and skills support, what that means is we avoid reflecting on how language constructs meaning within disciplines and how skills like, for example, referencing and citation practices are situated practices with histories and power dynamics of their own. We all have to learn, for example, as scholars and researchers, what's appropriate in different disciplines in terms of citation practices. And I've often been surprised by how different that is even in other humanities subjects, such as history. And I'm going to come back now to the third point about intercultural learning, because while this appears to be a superficially very positive attitude towards international students, what it can actually do is end up ascribing national static cultural knowledge to individuals, rather than treating them as individuals who will have various educational trajectories, various learning experiences, attitudes, and priorities. And I know that Heather will be picking up on that later on. Go to the next slide, please. So we did identify from some of our participants a range of more ethical and more internationally inclusive alternatives. For example, teaching and embedding the skills required to fully access and engage with the curriculum in the curriculum context. If you want students to write a good essay in history, for example, you need to teach them how to do it. Thank you, Jenna. And to do so in the context of the discipline acknowledges that the language and those skills are embedded in that context. Intentionally designing seminars through structured engagement opportunities and transparent pedagogy that articulates why certain decisions are being made and what students are supposed to get out of it helps everyone to participate. And these approaches extend beyond international students. They would benefit neurodivergent students, disabled students, non-traditional students of almost all stripes. Incorporating a range of alternative assessments within a broader program of study can help to embed employability skills, point that Miguel is going to come back to in a moment, requiring engagement with a broader decolonized canon of a reading list, accepting a wider range of forms of expression that extend beyond the traditional academic language. And that needs to be reflected as well in standards and criteria. And I'm going to come to a stop now and just do a plug for our resource pack from Advanced HE, which is linked from the slides, and I'll put a link in the chat now, which offers some practical tips and suggestions for how to put this into practice.
Thanks so much, Jenna and Sylvie, for setting this up so well. I'd like to talk a little bit more about well, the connection between international students and local communities. And it's a credit to CGHE that the audience is such, people come from such diverse countries and institutions that the definition of what a local community is will invariably be different for each each person listening. So obviously we're based at Manchester, and some of this research has come out of the University of Manchester and its understanding of its own relationship with its own local community, which is in the context of a large urban metropolitan area in the UK. So there are some parts here that hopefully will speak to other contexts, such as, say, campus universities, or perhaps other countries that have slightly different ways in which the higher education sector is organized. Hopefully these principles will you'll still find something useful. The idea being that well, the university is somehow seen as a kind of separate or distinct institution within its local community or geography, and that the university needs to reach out and form partnerships with its surrounding or its local community. So that's been spoken of in, for instance, the field of economic geography. There is a literature on anchor institutions. And in the field of higher education policy, which I'm about to go into, there is more policy work around building civic universities, or universities that take very seriously their quote-unquote civic responsibility, or the responsibility to local societies, not necessarily the academic community, but the wider society. Next slide, please, Jenna. So with regard to the link with international students, our common practices, again, in the context of Manchester, or perhaps where you are if you see kind of commonalities, is that there are student outreach and volunteer activities. So very often universities will say, well, our students have these connections to the local community via volunteer work, or they, for instance, care for the environment in a certain way. There are a range of ways in which the universities try to put students in touch with the wider community, well, at least some universities. But these are mostly targeted at home or local students, especially in the UK. For instance, this is quite developed at undergraduate level for local students. I'm not saying that it's always the case, but this is quite often the case. Another thing which speaks perhaps more to the challenge of having sustainable university community partnerships is that mostly these are one-off rather than well-structured long-term activities. So clearly there are limited opportunities for international students there. The other concern in the UK, which receives a large number of international students, many of whom want to engage in local economic activity, which means they want to do part-time jobs or find permanent jobs afterwards, is that there are also many cases in which local career opportunities or the career service have more resources dedicated to local students rather than international students. As I said, not always, but quite often the case. One thing that I will mention with regard to a common practice is that sometimes international students can even be actively warned from interacting with the local community. So I speak, for instance, in terms of data that we gathered on a British Academy project regarding the safety of Chinese students. So very well, in the UK, sometimes the police force will come into the university and speak to students to tell them, like, to give them advice. And with international students in particular, some police forces can be quite emphatic in their warnings about how to deal with local person. So if anything, it's almost the inverse. Some students have the impression that they have to be extremely careful when they interact with locals from a particular community. Next slide, please. So that's one of these ethical challenges I've just mentioned with regard to the example of structural activities, for instance, the kind of like advice from the police force that might give international students the wrong impression. But I think the broader problems are that the understanding of international students, local communities, is only framed in economic terms. So there have been a variety of reports. Quite recently, UUKI has released a quite prominent report highlighting the economic value of international students to local geographies in the UK. Of course, the report was a little bit longer and tried to talk about the cultural value, but quite widely in the popular press, it's only the economic figures that were reported. And this continues to be the main way in which the value of international students is seen, in terms of the money that they bring rather than any other form of local engagement. When cultural communities to local societies and communities are acknowledged, there is an implicit assumption that the fact that they're there is already enough to internationalize the local community. So this speaks to what Jenna had mentioned earlier, that within the university, if we have many international students, that means that we have a very diverse and intercultural academic community. And that spills out, that assumption spills out that, oh, because there are lots of international students on the university campus or at the local university, and therefore our city is international. And I think this is quite a lazy assumption that leads to a lack of planning and structural effort to really allow or put into place the opportunities and the structural pathways for international students to make contributions to the local community. Finally, going back to the deficit narratives mentioned earlier, there are widespread assumptions that international students don't have sufficient cultural knowledge or cultural skills to contribute to local needs. Next slide, please. So there are obviously ethical alternatives, and these will vary depending on the situation. As I said, there are a variety of contexts and a variety of interactions between town and gown, like the local community and the gown or the academic community. And these include intentional and structural inclusion of international students in partnerships that are made with local communities, and to acknowledge international students in knowledge transfer policies. So this civic university agreement that you're seeing on screen is in the context of a UK initiative that you'll see in the next slide, trying to bridge this gap. We also need targeted support to match international students with local businesses and organizations. And then we also need to think about institutional resources to provide, opportunities for local engagement when recruiting international students in the first place. So if we know that we will just keep international students in a bubble, maybe that should affect the ways that universities think about how many international students they recruit. Next slide, please. So this is just a visual slide of some of those activities, the ethical alternatives, as well as the kind of like initiatives where some of these ethical alternatives could be introduced or are already being done. The next slide will also have a link to some of the web links where you could get more information about some of our previous studies in our research group and some of the resources that I've mentioned regarding, the ways in which we can insert international students further into these practices.
Okay, thank you. All right, so my my bit of information, my contribution today is based on data that was collected pre-COVID. So this was when I could actually meet with students on campus, and it's a lot to do with the student voice, their thoughts, their experiences while they were studying in the UK. And I should note as well that it's with postgraduate students. So they were in the UK for a one-year master's programme. And it was a longitudinal style study where I met with them over the course of their year to find out what was really happening, how they felt about their studies in the UK and what was important to them.
The questions, the focus groups, the in-depth interviews were very open-ended, so it was really up to them what they wanted to talk about. And so I'm going to share with you some of the quotes that link with some of the things that have been talked about today already. Next slide, please. Thanks, Jenna. So as you can imagine, there were a lot of comments surrounding their academic experiences. This first one, for example, this person talks about education being a new subject for her. So this person was studying on a education-related master's degree, but this was something that was new. She'd previously studied business and economics. She was not familiar with education as a subject, but also being an international student, she was not really familiar with the UK education environment either. And I think this sort of highlights how it's important to sort of find out a little bit about the background. If you're not given this information about, you know, what students have previously studied, you might want to ask them, because this could be some of the reasons why perhaps they're not talking out in those seminars. Maybe they are having difficulty with certain texts or readings because perhaps they've never come across some of this information before. But unfortunately, what happens is, you know, as mentioned, perhaps the students get labelled as quiet or passive, or, you know, they've got language difficulties, and perhaps it's none of those things. It could be more down to the actual content material and the fact that they've never studied that before. The second quote that's mentioned here, links to the academic English, and this was a comment from a student, and they highlighted that a lot of their feedback that would come back, so they were getting comments on assignments that they submitted, and rather than having information about the actual content, about the subject they were studying, they were getting lots of comments about their academic English. And if you are not marking their academic English, then why would this be such a huge feature in the feedback that the students were getting? So rather than providing some useful things for that particular subject, help them to move forward with their thinking, with their ideas, in their knowledge generation with that particular topic, they were constantly being told about their academic English, which not only sort of, you know, made them feel really bad and self-conscious about their English, but then it didn't really help with their particular subject that they were studying. The quote below also links with language. You know, I still can't compete with some native speakers. Why are we expecting students to compete with language? You know, native speakers often make mistakes in their language as well, and that kind of, you know, again, making, you know, this particular person felt bad and felt that they were never going to be able to compete with some of the other people in their group. This final comment on the slide is talking about when they were actually in class, and again, you know, this is something that can happen with anyone. You know, I think with a lot of these comments, they're not necessarily subject to international students, but could be linked with any students. But again, it sort of links with perhaps not necessarily understanding the topic. Somebody is speaking very quickly, moving on to various ideas, and perhaps, you know, thinking a little bit more about the teaching environment, thinking about the activities that are being done, you know, linked with what Sylvie was saying and how classes are perhaps structured, and just being more aware of who's in your room and what the potential issues might be. Next slide, please, Jenna. Some of the other issues that they spoke about were around things that were, again, quite upsetting for them, linked to stereotypes and in some cases racism, which is things that have come up. You know, with the monetization of higher education, obviously international students are paying very high fees. There's accommodation costs, visa costs, etc. And there is often this assumption that if you are an international student and you've paid for all of those fees, that you must be rich. Now, some of the students that I spoke to, they were really upset by this. The quote about money bags. And then also, I spoke to one student and she'd actually had funding that had come from her wider family, and she was so grateful that her family had all chipped in to be able to pay for this, but then to be labelled as, rich. People would have often, make little comments about things, and that would really upset her. Particularly because she knew, she felt the burden that her family had helped pay for her education in the UK. Other issues, such as things like employability skills, and again, this sort of links back with what Sylvie was talking about, with the idea of, how relevant are the things, how transferable are the things that are being taught. Several people had mentioned how they found what they were learning to be very interesting, but then when they tried to transfer it back to their home country, it was not so easy. It's like, okay, well, yep, that's very nice to know, but how can I use that when I go home? So that kind of idea of thinking about what exactly is being taught. Next slide, please, Jenna. As well as the academic experiences and what was happening on campus, the students were also talking a lot about what was happening off campus. And actually, this is where they were often a lot more positive, because what they were doing, they had their own agenda. They were using the master's degree, their 1 year experience in the UK. Sorry, Jenna. Basically with their own plan. They've got their own plan, and they were using it to facilitate their own professional development, personal learning and independence. And I shall finish there, pass on to Josef.
Okay, thanks Heather, thanks everybody. So my presentation today is called Ethics and Etiquettes, International Students and Academic Hospitality. And it draws on a project I also did pre-pandemic a couple of years ago with a small group of students, looking at really the idea and practice of hospitality in higher education, and what Jenna referred to probably as an ethics of welcoming, which we probably try to explain, what could this ethics of welcoming look like in higher education context. Next slide, Jenna, please. So talking about hospitality is obviously talking about sort of a deep-seated sort of human practice, and which encapsulates really how many things around welcoming, and it relates to international students. In my research, I used the idea of welcoming to the idea of international students transition into the UK. So we'll talk a bit less about that today. I will talk more about how we can probably use the idea of academic hospitality as a way to both probably conceptualize, think further, but also practice and perhaps pose critical questions also on the way we are hospitable and welcoming to international students. Now, hospitality in a basic working definition is really about being generous and friendly in the treatment of guests and strangers. And according to Derrida, and coming back to the ethical dimension of hospitality, it's not simply one ethics among many others, but more of an ethos or of a culture itself. In other words, again, hospitality is a kind of cultural constant which is embedded in many cultures, and likewise sort of in many higher education cultures which are diverse and host a range of people. Now, academic hospitality, the concept I drew on, obviously it's not my own invention. I was heavily inspired by the work of Alison Phipps and Ronald Barnett, who wrote a wonderful piece on sort of academic hospitality as a metaphor, as well as a performative principle of action and practice, which takes on different forms and modalities. So some of the forms, for example, Barnett and Phipps outline is their material forms, which relates to the welcoming nature of our university campuses, architecture, classrooms, libraries, students to rest, to nourish, and to socialize, for example. The other forms of hospitality, and they're quite important, linking to virtual hospitality. So how does technology, our digital environment, support forms of welcoming and engagement, mutual engagement? There's other forms, and Heather touched on that, what Phipps and Barnett called linguistic hospitality, which is again linking to international students, bound up with the, this deficit discourse of improving language, of kind of, being that kind of things that's assessed and that's been sort of seen as a deficit. And there's other forms like touristic forms of hospitality where, students feel welcome and safe in the city they visit, or they engage in leisure activities, those kind of things. The important aspect also, and the one I picked up in my research as well, was this idea of hospitality in its epistemological form, which is really an openness and reciprocal activity towards others by sharing and receiving. And by sharing and receiving, we mean also this mutual process of sharing other knowledges, beliefs, ethics, and values, which might easily change our own understanding and transform our self-understanding as well. I think this links in what Sylvie said about decolonizing, for example, and picking up different forms of knowledge, but also critiquing ourselves. I want to finish this presentation by really talking a little bit about also what Phipps and Barnett called the modalities of academic hospitality. But what I want to do is really link it to sort of the past 1 or 2 years, which have seen the global pandemic, and I think which have accentuated somehow some of the unethical issues of engaging with the international student. So one of these modality of academic hospitality will be around celebration. And yes, we as university, at least in the UK, we celebrate diversity, or we tend to celebrate, a very diverse student body and staff body as well. Yet at the same time, the pandemic has seen, again, a huge increase of hate crime against international students, discrimination, also loneliness and anxiety, those kind of things where, particularly international students, and there's some strong evidence for that, being locked out up for weeks on end in their rooms and dormitories. So again, how have university, I know some universities have responded very well in supporting those students in a hospitable manner and a welcoming manner. Likewise, we were very good in picking up students from airports and hosting international welcome weeks for students, which usually quite separate from probably the wider student community. But where does this sort of hospitable engagement with students, this welcoming engagement with international students stop? Is it sort of thought through the international student life cycle, as it were? The other thing, and again, I think there's a link to COVID, is what could be termed as a communicative modality of academic hospitality, what means how to be welcoming in a virtual environment, and how, since much of our teaching, learning and assessment has moved online over the past 2 years, has created a lot of awareness, I think, of how we deliver our teaching and learning, how is it received as well. We probably saw a lot of empty screens, a lot of online silences, probably non-engagement as well sometimes, But also, I think what some research has shown, that also the digital university, or the Zoom university, has shown also the inequalities that exist globally of students having the opportunity to access, technology, to share technology. Often there were problems with, connectivity. We think of time difference, between where international students are located and the place of study as well. So I think this kind of virtual Zoom university has shown and asked questions about how can we actually be hospitable, how can we create an online environment that is inclusive, that's welcoming online environment. I know some of my colleagues, Sylvie and Jenna, have done some brilliant work on that already. The last thing I think is also this critical modality of academic hospitality, is also saying where are the limits and possibilities and taboos of academic hospitality. Hospitality is not this open, interchange and reciprocal interchange. It is also a power relation where probably the host is more powerful than the guest sometimes, and where there are limits as well. And I think that relates to some what Sylvie talked about in relation to best practice, for example. How do we critically assess our best practice, do we have to make this introspection and critical reflection what it is? On the other hand, this critical think of taboos in international, working with that international students and the ethics around it, is how careful do we have to be as lecturers, as teachers, as leaders, to engage with sensitive topics, for example, talking with Chinese students about Taiwan and Hong Kong, for example. So I stop here, and I've been slightly over time, but thank you very much. And I hand over, to our host, as it were.
Thank you, and thank you, colleagues, for letting me keep you to time. I'll leave our contact details up for just 10 seconds, but over to you, David. We're happy to take comments and questions about anything we've raised.
Brilliant. Well, we've all been very lucky, and I've never seen 5 presentations in one hour space, but not just presentations. Really thoughtful, critical reflections on this phenomenon. And we've had a taste of Derrida. We've gone to thinking quite sophisticatedly about coloniality, but also some really practical advice and thoughts. So I have a long series of questions myself, and of course lots of people in the chat as well, so please do look at the chat. My initial reaction is, of course, that this is such a great topic, because in some ways the history of international students in British universities starts at the period of the colonial university. And certainly if I think about Oxbridge and the way in which the university itself thought of itself as being an imperial university at certain points and wanted to attract students from around this empire of scholars. So, I think there's really important ways in which what you're all doing is helping us to return to think really hard about how the international students and the way we treat them tells us something about how we are, thinking about decolonizing the university more broadly. So thank you all very, very much. And I only wish we had more time to get everyone who's contributed questions out, but let's go as fast as we can. So I have a list of 3 or 4 people already, and I'm going to ask Light Duma to start, and then Vicky Crockett, and then Paula. So Light, you're on, please.
Yeah, hi everyone. I hope you can hear me, though I'm in a noisy place. But thank you so much to all the presenters. I think this is really an important topic, especially being an international student this year, having done my master's. So I think Joseph sort of touched on some of the things that I wanted to ask, but more so, during COVID, the inequalities really showed. Rather, they were very prevalent because, we're all coming from different places, trying to really engage and just trying to catch up with everything, with also the inhibitions of COVID, the lockdowns and all stuff. So I wanted to ask any of the panelists if you can expand more on what evidence you found that, how was the situation exacerbated by the situation, and really what would be the recommendations that maybe you found that worked, that, helped to keep international students engaged in their masters, especially during COVID. Thank you.
I wonder, is it okay, Sylvie, if we just take a couple more questions and then we can group them together, just so that we can get as many people in as possible? Is that okay, Jenna? Can I just ask Vicky and Paula in this group, and then perhaps everyone can hold on to their answers and bring them together? Vicky?
Yes, thanks so much for the opportunity. I myself am visiting here in the UK as a distinguished teacher from the US, and much of what you all were sharing resonated for me just because my work with secondary students, so that would be ages 12 through 18, because I know the structures are slightly different, are often impacted by some of those same challenges. So my question is, how do the panelists envision using this type of research, the data that you all have found, how can this be used to better inform teaching education programs so that we are also acclimating teachers on the secondary level about the importance of how they work with international students in order to support their learning, even at this level, because I would suspect that some of these challenges could be a trickle-up effect from what happens in those age groups as well. So I would love to know how you all envision this information possibly informing how we train teachers in the future.
Great. Thank you for that, Vicky. That's really interesting to think about how this links across. And Paula, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for your presentation. Can you hear me well? My connection seems terrible. Yeah? Okay. All right. Yeah, very connected. Thank you for this presentation. Very enlightening. And, you know, I'm a postdoctoral researcher, and I've been an international student my whole life. So it really resonates with my own experience as a student and now as a researcher in this area. So I just would like to raise some questions and just link it to a comment I made about these assumptions about what engagement is and this kind of expectation that every student should be bubbly and speaking and everything, otherwise they are not engaged. I mean, teaching staff are not neutral. So I was thinking, linking to Vicky's question, how can the multicultural and the multilingual classroom can be considered as a microcosm of a globalized society in terms of pedagogical practices to engage students rather than expecting them to like just discuss and get together, and this is international. And I was also wondering how useful it could be to parallel to the international students research, to do research with domestic students, because also there are lots of assumptions on the side of the students and the international students' body. But sometimes, for example, they don't engage with, for example, domestic students because domestic students might not be even interested in engaging with them. So that resonates again with the deficit narrative that doesn't fit here, you know, and in many contexts like Jenna just raised. So I was just thinking how useful it could be to see both sides to make this kind of critical analysis of what's going on in this space and what's the role of the teaching staff, the domestic students and international students. Thank you.
Jenna and team, over to you.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think two things I would just say shortly to the collection of questions. The question about how did COVID exacerbate issues? So Heather and I did a piece of research where we were analyzing tweets that had been made about international students during the pandemic. And I think the key findings from what we were seeing is about the exacerbation of social divisions, the sense of shunning and stereotyping of international students and assumption of them as disease carriers. So I think I can put a link to the preprint of that in the chat, but I think those are issues that we do have to contend with on a social level within our institutions, the damage that COVID has done in terms of relations between groups of students. To the other two questions about teacher education and expectations of engagement and whatnot, I mean, I think what I would really point to there is the need for more specific training of lecturing staff and other higher education staff members about how we work with international students. Sylvie and I did a research project where we interviewed around 50 lecturing staff across the UK, and I can count on one hand the number of them who actually had training for working specifically with international students. And I think that's quite shocking considering how much the presence of international students should be shaping our teaching practices. That most of our institutions have no required training for staff to work with international students, to me feels quite shocking. But I'll pass over to colleagues because I know they'll have things to say also.
Yeah, so if I could just pick up on Light's and Vicky's specific questions about how to engage international students during COVID. I'll refer you to the link I posted in the chat. It's my really short answer, but we did find lots of evidence of people who were finding ways within remote learning pedagogies to engage international students in more inclusive ways, and this refers to Paola's question as well. And I do think that that helped to change some lecturers' perceptions of what constituted appropriate engagement. Lecturers could start to see that using learning technologies like chat mechanisms, Padlets, online collaborative documents offered really good affordances to allow alternative mechanisms of engagement. And I have written a bit more on this elsewhere. I can post the link if colleagues are interested, but I think that that is a really important approach to embedding this philosophy of academic hospitality that Josef has articulated so clearly today into our classrooms and our teaching practices. And while, so to come to Vicky's question, I think it's rather the other way, that actually we should in some cases be looking to secondary school pedagogies for inspiration at the higher education level rather than vice versa, because I think the expectations for inclusivity, for the adopting of culturally responsive pedagogies are much stronger in secondary school provision than they are in higher education. There is, I think, a bit of an attitude in some cases that higher education is above that our students are adults and therefore we don't have to respond to those issues. And I noticed there was a question in the chat from Doria as well about professional development for HE lecturers. And yes, I think that can go some way to it, but we do come up again against this question of time and workload capacity. These are issues that really take reflexivity, and reflexivity takes time. In the massified model of neoliberal higher education, we are all short of time and we're all performing 15 different functions. And this was by far the most dominant theme in our discussions with lecturers, is how they wish they had more time to learn and develop professionally and reflect.
Thanks, Sylvie. That's really, really helpful, and brings it all back home together, really, which is how people might want to make the time to learn, but actually it's making that time that's hard. I wonder if I could go on and ask Alexander if she'd like to come. He should click forward to ask a question. I'm not getting. Okay. In which case I will, it was a comment really about understanding the context in which students are living and working. So that's very helpful, Alexander, thank you. Doria asked me to ask this question about the training, which you've already dealt with, Sylvie, so thank you for that. Yeah, Chiao, do you want to ask a question about classrooms and engaged classrooms?
Oh, I'm trying to start my video. Can you see me?
Good.
Yeah. So I have a question. Last week, I discussed with my other colleagues about what engaged classroom, or how an excited classroom should be like in this context. So we talk about, for example, in my country or in my sense, I don't think like being silent in classroom doesn't mean I'm not engaged in the classroom. So I'm wondering that reading this as an example, I'm wondering that how we define this kind of these definitions in Western context, like how we can achieve the decolonialism classroom, but we're all based on the Western concepts. I hope my question is clear. Thank you.
Yeah, Chair, that's a really interesting question. Are we making the classroom a sort of space that's sort of nowhere, or is it always somewhere? That's a really, really helpful question. I'll ask Yin Yang to come in before we get back to the panel.
Hello, thank you so much for this fantastic set of presentation. I have a question for Heather. I feel great interested in your study. You mentioned earlier about students' academic background, such as their subjects background, may influence their choice of programs and learning experiences in the UK. Based on your study, as opposed to their initial motives of studying in the UK and their academic background, have you found any consistency or inconsistency of students' behaviors in the UK? Yeah, I'm not sure whether I explained my question well.
No, that's fine. That's good. I think that's really helpful. And I'm going to just come in on behalf of Yi Cheng, because they don't have a microphone. And there is a really interesting question around how, as academics, we think about the relationships that students have with their families and lives and homes, and what that might mean for the pedagogies. So I think that's helpful as well, as to think not just about students in the classroom, but also the lives that they're also connecting to. And then there's a final comment, which I sort of wanted to come back to for all of you, really, which is provoked by Eddie West, but I'll sort of add my gloss on it. Because so Eddie asks about the question around for the finances of recruitment and what that might mean. I guess the question here then is the power of the commodification of education, and how hard it is to challenge that, and whether that's an asset with which to sort of, the wrong word, whether you can turn that round and make it into a resource for universities to recognize that they need to put more money into thinking about this because of the contribution these students make financially. And then okay, I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question. Gail, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you for the brilliant presentations, everyone. It was just really something I've observed. I support international students on the postgraduate programs in geography. I was just wondering if there should be more training provided for lecturers and teaching assistants to actually build confidence in us to even simply address international students' names. Sometimes you feel quite shy in terms of saying a Chinese student's name, getting it incorrect. I'm kind of getting over that now, but it's took a few years for me where I've just been like, you know what, go with it, and then say, if it's wrong, please correct me. But I think certainly for people new into teaching, just really to say it's okay to sort of feel that way, or maybe just to give some quick sort of overview of some of the more popular names and how to pronounce those. Like if we don't have like a Mandarin, for example, background, you don't know quite sometimes how to approach addressing them. And then I do feel that it acts straight away as a barrier. And I think sometimes this is the case with home students as well. It can kind of act as a barrier for sort of group discussions and things like that. So I just wondered if any of the panelists have any view about this and if it's come up before, really.
Great, thank you very much. It's over to you, panel, for your last comments. And as you can see, there's other things in the chat.
Can I try this? And I'm sure that my colleagues might be more experienced, but I totally agree with training, that it's necessary, it's totally required, and it's great what you're doing at your institutions, and you're doing first steps, probably even with Chinese language, if it's about Chinese international students. But I think there's also a point to be raised, and I think Jenna touched on that, on that still a lot of equality and diversity training and internationalization are quite divided in many universities. And I'm not suggesting that it's always a good way to combining that, but I think there's some, there's some excellent training going on in many EDI departments across university, but we see very little, in training with international students, wherever they are as well. I think when it comes to student training, I think, and again, it's very discipline specific, but, cross-cultural skills are a big employability asset, in a kind of a globalized work environment, as we tell many of our students, you're going to be released into. So I think there's probably more to see about probably also the pragmatic value, perhaps not, probably forcing in a way of socially engineering engagement and cross-cultural engagement, but perhaps sort of being a bit stronger in terms of saying this is an asset, this is a career asset as well. Mm-hmm. So that would be my point on that. But again, if anybody wants to come in.
Just very briefly, I think there was a point raised by Paula and touched on by other colleagues regarding the kind of like engagement between home students and now, as Gail is mentioning, home lecturers. So just the point about not making international students solely responsible for the practices of internationalization, and the idea that, well, you know, like it's up to them to internationalize the university wherever they are, and it's in a way up to them to kind of like engage in, to be responsible for that engagement, which is why I think it was a good point about that Paula raised, that we have to study this kind of like engagement from both sides, to understand like the needs, training needs, to understand the perceptions and perspectives of people like Gail who are wanting to do certain things but may or may not feel empowered to do them. So I think those are all very important. We're certainly not the first group to try and attempt that. That's been done in by other persons, but like I think it's a message that bears repeating again, that yeah, it's good to understand this from different sides, and also not to make the international students or international colleagues, you know, in addition, not only students but international colleagues solely responsible for that process. And I'm pretty sure we won't be able to answer so many questions, but anyway, thanks for like the space.
Yeah, I think just to say that these questions are so amazing, and I wish that we had more hours to spend. But I think these are the kind of questions that, you know, there is no best practice or how to of how to appropriately work with international students. There's no right answer, but these are the kind of questions we should be asking. And I think Chao's question about you know, colonial assumptions of what we're bringing into our classroom are the kind of things that we need to be questioning. And if we're not asking those questions, then I think we are being unethical. So yeah, that's what I'll end on.
I would like to really thank all of you again for keeping to time and making this such a productive dialogue. And there's so much happening in the chat that is for all of us to benefit from and think about. I hope the fact that some people came along and joined in shows that people are really thinking hard about this in relationship to their own practice. But it's clearly a huge area for research. And so you've done a great job, team, Jenna and colleagues. Thank you all for your time, and come and join us again soon at another CGHE webinar. There's a next one on Thursday, which is entitled From Theory to Application and Back Again, the interplay between research and higher education and engineering education. We look forward to welcoming you to that and to other webinars. We're here every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, UK time, GMT, 2 p.m. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.